So now that we've played with basic shapes and models, let's talk about materials. We'll find materials over in our starter asset palette. We can slide all the way down and we'll start to see them come into view directly after the models. But the easier way to just pull up the materials by themselves is to click on the second material icon. Materials, like the models, have two different sections. We have the Substance materials at the bottom of the list, and we have the Adobe standard materials at the top of the list. It is super easy to apply the materials to your models. Just choose the material that you want, click, hold, and drop it on the item. If you decide that you don't like this material, all you have to do is drag and drop another one on top of it. A couple of things change whenever we put a material on a model, and it's really important that you know what's going on in your interface, because if not, you could get lost. So the first thing that happens is it drills down in the scene menu to the actual material. You can see anything else on my stage is now gone, and we are just looking at the cube material. If I want to get back to the main stage, which has my environment lights or other models, I have to hit this back arrow. It's important that you're paying attention to that scene palette because it kind of tells you where you are. Right now, I'm on the cube itself, and my properties are going to change the cube. But if I double click on the cube, I can see what it's wearing. Now my properties are focused on the material, and all of these items are just as customizable as the model itself. So what does that mean? That means you have a lot of options. Let's take a look at some examples. I'm going to start simple. I've gone back to my starter asset palette and I've clicked on my models. I'm going to pull a sphere out onto my stage. Now I'm going to go to my materials by clicking on the second icon. I'm going to pull the glass onto my sphere. I can now see that I have kind of like a crystal ball, but maybe I want my crystal ball to have more of a tint to it. Maybe a blue or a purple tint to make it look more mystical. I know that my properties palette lets me change things about either the material or the model itself. I'll look up at my scene and make sure that I'm on the model material. Looks good so far. Now I'm going to move down to my properties panel and I can see that my base color is white. That's why my sphere doesn't really have any color. But if I click on it, now I can move around the spectrum and choose a different color for my crystal ball. We have a couple of options underneath here that we need to talk about. For now, we're going to ignore offset and repeat. We'll come back to those in a later tutorial. But opacity, roughness, metallic, and glow are pretty standard when you're dealing with materials. You can use opacity to fade the effect of the material if you need to, but 100% means that you're seeing 100% of the material. If I start to fade out the opacity on glass, the whole model starts to disappear. So it can get a little confusing. Most of the time, you'll never bring the opacity down unless you're trying to get a ghost kind of feel. The next property is roughness. That's how smooth the surface of your material is. If the roughness is set at 0, it's going to have a glass-like finish, super smooth, super shiny. As we start to move the roughness up, it's kind of like taking sandpaper and starting to scrub that surface. If we bring the roughness all the way over, it's going to take most of the reflection out. Next up is metallic. I'm going to bring my roughness all the way back down so that you can see how cool metallic is. At 0, there's no metal in the material, but as we start to move it up, we start to see some reflections. Until we have a super shiny, reflective surface. If we want something that looks more like brushed aluminum, or if we want to rough up the metal a little bit, we can bring our roughness up and we get a different type of metal look. Our last property is glow. As we start to bring that up, we can see that we're starting to get a glow from within the object that passes through the material. This is going to behave differently depending on the type of material that you have, but it's a great way to lighten up the material. Now, every standard material is going to have additional properties that will differ. And when I spin open translucence, it gives me some additional ways to modify my glass. So I can make it less translucent or more translucent. I can change the index of refraction. That's how the light passes through the glass. I can change the density of the glass and make it a solid sphere, a solid glass sphere, or maybe a hollow glass sphere. And I can also change the interior color of the glass. You have a lot of options, and that's just in a sphere. Let's take a look at some of the other materials. As I pull out a metal, I can see that I still have these same basic properties, and metal also uses translucence. In fact, as I pull all of these Adobe standard materials over, and if I'm keeping an eye on my properties, not much changes. Just the color, the roughness, opacity, and metallic and glow, and the translucence changes. But I don't have a lot of other options. That doesn't mean that Adobe standard materials aren't incredibly powerful. These little plus signs allow you to add additional properties to the properties, but don't worry about that. We'll talk about that later. Instead, let's scroll down to the second section, Substance Materials. Adobe Substance Materials are professional grade, industry standard 3D materials. These things are amazing. They're used by professional artists and animators in things like video games, architectural design, and Pixar movies. Each of these materials is created in a painstaking process. They're designed for maximum impact and to create the most realistic textures in the 3D space. So yeah, these are pretty amazing. I'm gonna grab one real quick and throw it on my sphere. And I can see under my properties that my metallic, roughness, opacity, and glow are no longer an option under properties. But I have some technical parameters as well as some miscellaneous items. Now these properties are going to change with different types of materials. So when I pull out chocolate, I can see I have option for fibers, color, roughness. I have basic parameters. Let's try ceramic. Now I have dirtiness, color variance, tile amount. All of these make the material very easy to customize, but don't be afraid of it. It's just like your standard materials. You have your properties over here and you can play with them until you find a look that you like. The only difference is that substance materials just usually have a lot more sliders. So that's it. You have two types of materials, Adobe standard materials and substance materials. To use them, all you have to do is drag and drop them on the model of your choice. Don't forget how to find them in your scene palette. Remember, this is the name of the model, and this is the material that's on the model. To get back to the main part of your scene, you have to hit the back arrow. If you want to go back into your material and fix the properties, you'll have to double click next to the model and bring up the properties here. There's also an additional shortcut to get to the material on your model, and that's here in our fourth palette, which we haven't discussed yet, Actions. But it's right here on the end, and you can tell because it has the little material icon next to it. Click on that, and it's a shortcut to your properties. So now it's your turn to play. Pull out a couple models, throw some materials on it, and go see what you can do with the properties. I'll meet you back here at the next lesson.